Yeah, it's a good point because self-managed super funds are not suitable for everyone. We know that. You do need to have the time to take on the roles and responsibilities of being a trustee. Of course, when you do set up a self-managed super fund, you are taking on that role of being a trustee. So you do have to have an understanding of the roles and responsibilities that are associated with being a self-managed super fund trustee. So, the important things are being aware of the record-keeping obligations that come with being a self-managed super fund trustee, knowing your statutory reporting obligations, so the need to lodge returns, the need to have your fund audited every year, so you do need to go through that process of appointing an auditor and making sure your fund is audited. So being aware of those reporting obligations and recording obligations that you have as a trustee. And the other thing is being aware of the investment rules. We know that one of the more significant breaches that occur in the self-managed super fund sector are those funds that are lending money to their related companies and so forth. So having an understanding of what you can and can't do in terms of your investments. There are rules that you need to follow, so being aware of what those rules are very important. And of course, we've just seen new penalties come into play. So from 1 July, we do have a new penalty regime in place for self-managed super funds trustees nowadays. So the ATO, in addition to the penalties they've always had to prosecute trustees, they do now have some new penalties at their disposal, which is even more of a reason for trustees to be aware of their responsibilities of being a trustee. Well, there's 3 new penalties. So these new penalties, as I said, apply in addition to what the powers have always had. Of course, one of the problems, and I think we shouldn't get too carried away with thinking that there is a problem with the compliance culture in the self-managed super fund sector. That's certainly not the case. The statistics tell us that around 2% of self-managed super funds have reported breaches every year. And in fact, in the 12-13 financial year, which is the most recent year that we have statistics on this, there was actually a reduction in the number of reported breaches. So, it'd be wrong to assume that we've got these new penalties because we've got a compliance cultural problem in the self-managed super fund sector. The reason they've introduced these new penalties because the previous regime really was difficult for the ATO to apply. When the ATO did apply penalties, it tended to have very severe implications on the self-managed super fund, and so for that reason they very rarely imposed penalties on self-managed super fund trustees, only in situations where it was a very severe breach. So it tended to be an all or nothing approach under the old regime, but from 1 July this year there has been some new penalties introduced that the ATO has at their disposal, and these new penalties will allow the ATO to take action against trustees. And the type of action they can take is much more appropriate given the type of breach. So the new penalties, the first one is an education direction. So this is new. This is where the ATO can direct the trustees to undertake a certain course of education. Now the ATO will need to approve the education course, and at the moment there's only one course that's been approved. It has to be an online course and it has to be free of charge. So any trustees who receive one of these education directions from the ATO will need to attend a course. As I said, it's an online course. They will need to produce evidence that they have successfully completed the course. And this type of penalty we think will be imposed on trustees who perhaps are, it's their first offence, perhaps they've only just recently set up their self-managed super fund, and the contravention was due to their lack of understanding. You wouldn't expect the ATO to be issuing this type of penalty to trustees who are repeat offenders. So we see it being used for perhaps first-time offenders. So that's one new power that they have. They also have what we call a rectification direction, where they'll be able to direct the self-managed super fund trustees to actually rectify a breach. Now this is a power that they haven't previously had. In the past, they've had to rely on trustees coming forward and saying, well, this is how we will fix the breach, an enforceable undertaking, they call it. But under this new power, the ATO will be able to go on the front foot and direct the trustees to actually fix the breach. They can instruct the trustees as to what they need to do to fix the breach and when they have to do it by, so a specified time frame. And the trustees will have to show evidence that they actually have fixed the breach. And the third new penalty power that they have is an administration penalty. So these are penalties, monetary penalties, which the ATO can impose on self-managed super fund trustees who breach certain provisions of the SIS Act. There are certain lists of sections of the superannuation legislation that if the trustees breach, they may incur an admin penalty. Now these penalties can be imposed without court action, and that's the big difference with the previous regime. Under the previous regime, the ATO could only impose monetary penalties on trustees, but it did require court action. So they had to go to court, which was time-consuming and costly for everyone involved. Under this new penalty power, they will be able to impose those penalties without taking court action. Now, the important thing to note about these penalty powers, or these administration penalties, is they can only be imposed if the ATO actually audits a self-managed super fund. Now, the ATO will risk assess any contraventions that they receive from auditors, or based on annual returns that they receive, they may risk assess a self-managed super fund. If the fund finds itself in the high risk category, then it will be subject to an ATO audit. If at that time the ATO finds a breach which incurs an administration penalty, they'll have no option but to impose a penalty. So this is not a discretionary penalty, it must be imposed, but you will have the ability to negotiate with the ATO on what that penalty should be. So the ATO does have the power to reduce that penalty depending on the circumstances. Excuse me. So if you do find yourself in that situation as a trustee where you do incur administration penalty, you will have the right to negotiate what that penalty should be. Now, just to give you an idea of what some of those penalties are, they range from about $850 for failing to give the ATO statistical information when you're required to do so, or failing to comply with an education direction that I spoke about before, $1,700 for failing to lodge returns, right up to $10,200 if you breach one of the investment rules. So the rules around lending money to members and so forth. So you can see that it's a scaled penalty approach, which will give the ATO, the ability to impose penalties which are, more appropriate given the seriousness of the event and the nature of the contravention.